very kind. Thank you very much. It's very nice. Thank you.
Okay.
We appreciate your business.
Okay. I know. If you have empty seats right next to you, please raise your hand so we can actually fit more people. Thank you. Today is Friday, April 12th, 2019. It is 3 p.m., and this is panel number 4503, entitled Xenophobia, History, and Hysteria. I'm Adrian J. Shin, the moderator of this panel and a faculty member in the Department of Political Science, specializing in the political economy of migration and inequality.
Closer.
You have to get very close to the microphone. No, very close.
All right, so we have a couple of announcements. Thanks for the feedback. First, there is an overflow room in the third floor if you are looking for just space to take a break. And also there are listening devices in the back available if you would like to have some hearing aids as well. Unfortunately, due to the unpleasant weather conditions, the party that was scheduled for today at 4:30 on the Hill has been canceled. But several Hill restaurants will be offering an extended happy hour and other discounts. Okay. So we have three distinguished panelists joining us today. Miriam Jordan is a national immigration correspondent at the New York Times. She reports from a grassroots perspective about the impact of U.S. policy on immigrants, employers, and the country at large. And we have Joe Cirincione, is president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation. He's worked on nuclear weapons policy in Washington for over 35 years and is considered one of the top experts in the field.
It's hard to believe.
And we have Karolina Quiroga. She's a Colombian storyteller, performer, who has researched a vast selection of myth and traditional tales from the length and breadth of Hispanic and Latin America. All right, so this panel proceeds in the following manner. Each panelist will have about 5 to 7 minutes to give an opening remark. I'll provide a more detailed bio of the panelists before each remark. After the round of the opening remarks, the panelists will have time to respond to each other. This is often the most interesting part of the panel, and the audience can follow up on the discussion with questions, so stay tuned. In this CWA session, we'll utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. All right, so our first speaker is Miriam Jordan. She's a national immigration correspondent at New York Times. Through intimate stories of immigrants, she has explained to readers chain migration, visas known by esoteric terms like H-1B, and programs such as DACA. She chronicled the Trump administration's family separation policy that was unveiled last year. Her accounts of the Trump administration family separation policy spotlighted the experience of separate children, the reunification of families once the policy was suspended, and the trauma of both children and parents as they tried to settle into life in the United States. Before joining the paper, she worked in Brazil, India, Hong Kong, and the United States for the Wall Street Journal. She previously worked for Reuters news agency in Mexico, Israel, and Brazil, where she was raised. Jordan earned an undergraduate degree in international relations from Stanford University and a graduate degree in journalism from Columbia University. She speaks Portuguese, French, Spanish, and wait, Hebrew. Welcome, Miriam.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor, and it's great to see a full house on a topic that really is current. Even before Trump came into office over the years, I've definitely been sensing, as I report across the country on immigrants from all over the world who have been settling here in large numbers in this massive wave that started in the 90s, that there's a lot of discomfort among many Americans, especially Caucasian Americans, with the changing face of the country. And it is indeed true that the face of this country is less Caucasian, probably by the year, if not by the day. That has translated into expressions of xenophobia, which I regard as, to a large extent, fear of the unknown and resistance to change or accepting change. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of just historical background and some data that looks at the main two groups that have come in this big wave of immigration since the 90s, and that is Latin Americans and Asians. So hostility toward foreigners has waxed and waned throughout US history. At the turn of the 20th century, restrictionists denounced Italian and Eastern European immigrants as being crime-prone, diseased, and unable to assimilate. After isolationist sentiments flared during World War I, nativists in Congress pressured then President Warren G. Harding into signing the first Immigration Quota Act in 1921. That law effectively ended the open door policy that had allowed millions of foreigners fleeing for their lives to settle in the United States in previous decades. The National Origins Act of 1924 further slowed the flow, and the impact of that lasted for decades. the flow of immigrants to the United States did not pick up again until the 1960s. Today's debate is partly a reaction to the fact that the U.S. is now home to more than 35 million foreign-born individuals, which is an all-time high in absolute numbers. The density of the foreign-born population in the country is roughly 15%, a share that last reached that level during the massive wave of immigration from the 1880s to 1920s, according to scholars of immigration. So in recent years, or in the last couple of decades, we've seen this resurgence of nativism, as some scholars call it, that has become as intense as it was during that last peak of immigration from the 1880s to 1920s. The contemporary wave of immigration, 1990s and 2000s, is mainly Latin American and Asian, and it has reached pockets of the country that had been untouched by immigration for decades. And the fact that a large number of the immigrants, 11 million, are here illegally further inflames passions. In my opinion, most of the ire is directed toward the Latino population. But interestingly, the growth in the population of Latinos here, who are now the nation's largest minority, having surpassed blacks, has slowed substantially since the Great Recession, and most Hispanics in the country today were born in the United States. They're not immigrants. The Hispanic population's growth, so it continues to grow, albeit at a much slower rate, is about 3% annually now, and which is about half of what it was in the 90s. And the result of this, I guess somebody didn't like that. So the result of that, I mean, and the reason behind the slow growth is that there's lower fertility or smaller families, and there's less immigration, despite the fact that we have so many thousands of families arriving and we have this crisis at the border. Immigration still pales compared to what it was in the year 2000, when we had like 1.6 million people crossing the border. And in any event, these two trends of lower fertility among Latinos and less immigration from Latin American countries, really do underscore the end of this demographic earthquake that was unleashed by the rapid Latino population growth that began in the late 90s. And that growth was spurred by, demand for labor in the United States. I mean, I wrote a story several years ago about how Phoenix had been transformed into the 5th largest city in the country on the backs of the labor of immigrants who had then spawned, who had built, many of the exurbs of Phoenix, had built many retirement communities, had helped build many of the golf courses and maintain them for the well-to-do who play there. Yet suddenly Arizona became kind of ground zero in the immigration debate, and really was the first state that since the 90s, when California tried this, passed a very strong anti-immigrant bill called SB 1070 to try to catch and deport every undocumented immigrant in its midst. In any event, despite the slowdown, let's be honest, Latinos still represent 54% of the nation's population growth. What's interesting, and my time is running out, is that now what the biggest contingent of foreign-born people, or the fastest-growing contingent of foreign-born individuals in the United States, are Asians. Asia's emerged as the largest source. Nearly 2/3 of Asians in the U.S. are foreign-born, so more of them are foreign than the Latinos. And fueled by the arrivals from Asia, immigrants and their children will account for the lion's share of U.S. population growth over the next 50 years, according to many immigration scholars. And my time is up.
Our next speaker is Joe Cirenzioni, president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation, and he's one of the top experts in the field. In addition to his careers in public policy research, and as staff on the House of Representatives committees on armed service and government operation. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former member of the International Security Advisory Board for Secretaries of State John Kerry and Hillary Clinton. He's also the author of the books Nuclear Nightmares, Bomb Scare, Deadly Arsenals. There are some subtitles there, but
They're romance novels.
and
would've sold
his
better.
commentary has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Financial Times, just to name a few. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you very much. Thank you. A pleasure. There is nothing automatic about xenophobia. I think it's common for peoples to have fears and distrust of the others, whether that's people coming into your tribal area or crossing your border or coming in through ports of entry. But xenophobia, whipping this up into a fear, an hysteria, phobic reaction, is something I think that's created by our leaders, and in this case by governments, to accomplish specific political purposes or economic purposes. Some of that may be domestic, to hold wages down, make it difficult for immigrants to get jobs, and therefore they will work for lower wages and be more easily dismissed and more reluctant to, or incapable of unionizing. And some of it is for foreign policy aims, and that's what I'm going to talk about, and how we're seeing xenophobia in our current foreign policy. This is something I've been thinking about recently and trying to come to grips with why we're still in the Middle East. Almost 18 years after what was supposed to be a very short mission to get the people who attacked us, has turned into permanent stationing of U.S. forces in heavily militarized operations, now in some 80 countries where we are combating terrorism. And in thinking about this, I'm also struck by the coming anniversary we have, 75th anniversary, I think, of the Normandy invasion. I know a number of my peers are going to celebrate that anniversary in June. And shortly after we invaded Germany, we conquered Germany and ended the European phase of World War II. And I think that's the last time that the United States government has had concentrated military campaigns against white people. All our wars since then have been against brown and yellow people. And I may, unless I'm missing something, they've all been in Asia. Eastern Asia, Western Asia, and that's where we are now. And so you can't talk about xenophobia without talking about race, without trying to come to grips with whether there is a deep racist undertone to American foreign policy at this point. And it's not something we like to think about. It's uncomfortable. We don't think of ourselves as a racist people. But we're clearly seeing these fears fanned by the President of the United States and the people that he's attracted around him, and by people on the equivalent of our state media on Fox News, where we have people like Tucker Carlson embracing white nationalism. And I am, in addition to the immorality of these policies, to their violation of the basic American ethic, the basic American core value. We are a nation of immigrants. My grandparents came here at the turn of the 20th century and suffered some of the indignities, thank you, that the Irish suffered before them and conquered them. But this is something different. This is something different. we'll talk more about the domestic aspects, but what worries me the most is how this could be used to start a new war in the Middle East. And we're seeing it particularly with Iran. I mean, we are elevating Iran to phobic status, greatly exaggerating the threat they represent to American interest or to their neighbors. That we have differences with them. They are doing many things we don't like, including the oppression of their own people, the Iranian government. But they are not a threat on the scale of Nazi Germany, yet that is not how they're being portrayed. And we see things that were formerly considered almost inconceivable, recommended in the past, but rejected, happening this week with the U.S. designation of the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. As a terrorist organization. That means that about 11 million Iranians are now categorized as terrorists. We've never done this before, categorize a military arm of a foreign government as a terrorist organization. And that, sort of epitomizes the idea that these Iranians are, that the nation is a terrorist nation. You saw Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this week on Capitol Hill link Iran to Al-Qaeda. To link Iran to Al-Qaeda, the same kind of tactic that was used in 2003 to link Saddam Hussein to Al-Qaeda. This is demonstrably false. But you see the idea. You look, and why? Because these are foreign people. These are of a certain color of skin. This is they speak a certain language. And do Americans distinguish between Persian and Arabic? I'm not sure they know. Between Shia and Sunni, I'm not sure they know. It's all one homogeneous threat that is raised, that we have to take action or these people will kill us. They will come after us. And I believe this is a conscious policy in order to justify the kind of action that Americans would never support. We saw it in Iraq, same fanning of the flames, to get people to commit to an invasion of another land which they otherwise would never support. And even now, 18 years later, seeing what a disaster that war was, seeing how it's cost us $6 trillion to date, killed hundreds of thousands of people, mostly non-white. Still, there are some in the United States that want to do this again. But in order to get Americans to go along with this, they've got to present this threat as not just militarily significant, but almost racially significant. That this is a battle of civilizations, that we have to counter this foreign threat because they are coming after us, even though the war we want to engage in is thousands of miles from our shore. So this xenophobia is not just an academic issue, it's not just a domestic issue, it's a vital national security issue. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Karolina Quiroga. She's a Colombian storyteller. She has developed a distinctive bilingual style of telling that shines with poetic intensity. Her performances find common language and meanings to convey powerful images in her tales. She has performed in schools, libraries, and festivals in Texas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mexico, and Costa Rica. She's been telling stories on stage for over 10 years. She has a master's in storytelling from East Tennessee State University and a master's in arts management from the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya de Barcelona. In 2013, she was named Outstanding Performer of the Year by the ETSU Storytelling Program. In 2016, she received the J.J. Renault Emerging Artist Grant, and she became a teacher artist at the Wolf Trap Institute for Early Learning through the Arts in Vienna, Virginia. Currently, she's part of the Texas Commission on the Arts touring roster 2018 to 2019. In 2018, she launched on iTunes and SoundCloud a bilingual storytelling podcast called Tres Cuentos, dedicated to the myth, legends, and folk tales of Latin America. Welcome, Karolina.
Well,
since I'm a storyteller, I'm going to tell you a story. So I actually put a performance on immigration, immigrants about 3 years ago in San Antonio, Texas, when I was living there, because I wanted to prove to the people that in the folk tales, there's evidence that people has migrated. And folk tales have been told for thousands of years, so what's the big fuss, right? So one of the stories that I shared was called The Potato, and it's a Bolivian tale, and it's mainly about this group of people called the Cacaris, and they had a terrible disaster, natural disaster in their homes, and they had to leave it all behind. So they start migrating, and they reach this beautiful paradise. But of course, this paradise has some owners, people inhabiting and having a beautiful life. And since the story was told and written by the descendants of the ones that became victims, who are the ones who were living in the paradise, of course, the Cacaris are portrayed as the horrible monsters that came and took over. And so in the story, it says that the Cacaris attacked these people that were living in peace in their paradise. They didn't even ask for help or, may I come in, can we join? No, they didn't, just came and attacked and enslaved the people that were there. But of course, there's going to be a hero, and the hero was, of course, the son of a chief. It couldn't mean anybody else, of course. It has to come from divine right. And the gods talk to him, Pachacamac talks to him, and tells him that there's a way for them to get out of there, and is by planting the potato. Since they are slaves, they don't have much to eat, and when they start planting the potato, they realize that they can get stronger, because when you're a slave, you don't get feed up too much, right? Because they want you to be able to perform your duties, but not to rebel. Of course, you should not have that much energy. That's the point. So once they start eating better, they are able to mobilize their own people, take over, and kick the other guys, the bad guys, out, right? So this is a story that, of course, anyone that considers themselves as the people that were living in the paradise would totally side with them, right? Because they were living in peace, and these other guys, how could that happen? But the story was written by those initially victims and later heroes. And that's how the entire history of our world has been written. So every time we hear any of those stories in which we have these big, gigantic heroes, my question is it really? I'm sure there are other versions of that story. So that was my first story, and a lot of times I met the other day an Italian guy that works in traveling, and he asked me, I'm from Colombia, and we were talking, and he said, I told him, I found out that there's some Latinos that voted for Trump. But that's kind of surprising for me. But maybe they were fooled at the beginning. I don't think so. The guy was pretty clear since the beginning. It's not like he's coming with new shows now. No, he laid it out from the beginning pretty clear who he was, what he wanted to do. If you were fooled, well, you fooled yourself. But if a Latino voted for him, and so this guy tells me that the ones that he met were Cubans, and that he voted for him because they didn't want other people, other Latinos, to come and take their own jobs. And so I'm thinking to myself, all this time we're blaming the white people for all this, but it's not only Caucasians, the ones that are feeling threatened about these things. It's absolutely anybody else that has a job or that considers this country or what they have achieved here a paradise. So as you were saying, yeah, we of course, as humans, we tend to feel that some animosity towards anything that is strange, but we have made it this far and so many struggles. So yeah, my question is, what's the big fuss? And my answer to that is blame human rights, blame the media, blame the concept of nations. Those three concepts, those three powers started 200, 300 years ago as it is. And the moment you knew that people have rights, you start questioning. And it's a good blame, by the way. It's not like I'm saying but humans shouldn't have rights. But there's a beautiful movie called Voltaire is Voltaire's Fault. Voltaire said that everybody is equal, right? And there's this guy in the movie, he comes from Sudan, I think, from Africa, and he comes to France and he thinks he can do it all. And everybody, he's deported, and he's like, but wait, why are you deporting me? Voltaire told me that everybody here is equal. It's Voltaire's fault. And it is when we have human rights, women's rights, all the rights that came with that, it came with enlightening. We were able to see that for thousands of years we've been killing each other and no one made a fuss out of it, right? People were like, this is my territory, I'm just gonna, square this thing out, I'll kill you, you kill me, and that's it, we move on with our lives. But the moment human rights came, we start asking each other, should we do it like that? And then media came, and of course they put it outside. And we need to see that, of course, because before, for thousands of years, no one was seeing that. No one was questioning themselves. So I think that's good. I'm good with that.
All right. Thank you very much for your thoughts and insights. If any of the panelists would like to follow up on the discussion, please feel free to do so. I'm also accepting questions from the audience.
I feel you were on a roll when you ran out of time, and I was wondering if there's any other points that you wanted to make at the bottom of your paper that you didn't get to finish.
Well, I guess I was just going to probably end by, saying that this country, from where I started, is less and less Caucasian, and that continues to be a real sore point with a lot of people. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a reporter who travels a lot across the country, east to west, north to south. People often are pretty open about the fact that they don't like hearing Spanish being spoken. I remember when I was in Arizona, somebody came up to me. We were like, I made a stop at a McDonald's, on my way to the border, and they turned to me, and because people were working in the back speaking Spanish, I was like, this is America. Why don't they learn English? And I mean, I wasn't there to lecture them and say, well, maybe, your great-grandfather who came from Germany and settled in Wisconsin, I don't know how much English he ended up learning by the time, his days were over, but then his, his grandchildren are assimilated. And I truly believe when I walk into a kindergarten class, even if it's in the most, Hispanic section of Los Angeles, that there is something called America, and these kids are all chattering in English, no matter that they speak Spanish at home, and they are absorbing whatever it is in the air that constitutes America. But on the other hand, I have felt of late among older kids, like 12, 13, 14, who have parents who are immigrants and who they fear could be deported any moment, that despite being born here, they are having some struggles with their own identity and their relationship to the country. So while they might be, like I remember being in Ohio, and, these kids once said, yeah, LeBron here, and I don't know, he was calling out whatever, Stephen Curry there, and then, they look like any American kids playing. They were Mexican Americans. Afterwards, in a conversation that I had with them, they told me that they didn't think of themselves as American, and I don't know how we got there. I wasn't having like an intellectual discussion with them, but they're like, no, I'm Mexican. And the other kid said, yeah, I'm Mexican. I'm like, well, weren't you born here? Yeah, but I'm Mexican. That's what people tell me I am. Like, that's what my people say my parents are. My parents were born in Mexico, so I guess I got to be Mexican. And that didn't sit well with me. And I think that doesn't bode well for the country. So.
Well, now that you may remind me of a story in a pre-K. I was working in Tennessee in Head Start. I was the interpreter for the little children, the Hispanic children that didn't speak yet any English, Spanish, and their families. And I was assigned to this classroom in which we have two little boy twins, Hispanic, of course, Mexican descendant. But they wouldn't talk, because twins tends to be like that, no? Once they settle on something, that's what it is. You can't break that bond there. So I'd been told by the previous interpreter the situation, and you just have to, be patient with the kids. Anyway, when I came into the classroom, of course, it's a pre-K classroom, and all the kids are gonna love you no matter what, just because you show up. And so there's a little boy, and he's a white little boy. He's adorable. And he just wants to be around me and sit on my lap and everything. And, of course, he saw my tag. And in my tag, there's my picture. Now, when they took the picture, they took it with a flash. And so I look pretty white there. So he's looking at the picture, and he's like, is that you? And I'm like, yes, that's me. That's not, no. This person is white. You're not white. So I'm thinking to myself, this kid has 4 years old, and he's already been able to identify that far. Now, then we were having lunch next week, and he said it really loud. And here's my two Mexican little kids, and they don't talk at all. But he's sitting here, the little white boy here next to me, because I'm like the sun. He just orbitates around me. And I don't know what exactly was the situation, but he said it really loud. Those Mexicans are pigs! And I'm like, wait, what? He's only 4 years old, and I just want to go and hug the little boys and say, like, oh, you didn't hear this, you didn't hear this. But of course, and I look at them, seeing if they're having any reactions, and they just keep eating, like it's not with them. Of course, they don't have no idea what nationality they are, because they're only 4 years old. But that just gives me an idea. I mean, this is a low-income community, and they live in those trailers. So apparently, I told the teacher later, and she told me that they live close to each other. But in such a small setting, you already seeing the seeds of racism. Just because apparently the Mexican family had brought a pig for Christmas that they killed there to eat the pig, of course. And that's what people do. If you want to eat a pig, you have to kill it, right? You just can't eat it alive or swallow it. And so, but of course, the parents had to make this big fuss about the whole thing that the kid absorbed in a different way. And my question is, what's going to happen next?
All right, so panelists, please feel free to jump into the discussion, but I'm gonna have to ask some questions. So the opposition to immigration has lots of sources. There are about 3 different sources that were mentioned by one of the questions. The first is national security reasons, right? That some immigrants are dangerous, so we need to kick them out. The second is that, they're culturally distinct. They just cannot be possibly integrated into American society, right? Benjamin Franklin used to say that, he smells too much like sauerkraut in a German household, and they don't speak English at all. So he was actually very worried about the future of the nation, right? And the third factor is economic competition, right? So in your opinion, what are some of the things that actually matter? Is it economics? Is it culture? Or is it national security? And one comment about the nuclear weapons is that what's the benefit of using racism when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, right? So I heard this conspiracy theory that the U.S. officials thought that it was okay to put atomic bombs in Japan because they didn't think that they were actually equals, right? So I don't know if it was true or if it was actually mentioned in any of the official records. So I would love to hear from Joe, if you could make some comments about that.
Yeah. The first Harry Truman knew about, as vice president, the first he knew about the atomic bomb was when he became president, when he was sworn in. And there's people sometimes think that Harry Truman then ordered the bombing of Japan, but in fact there is no such order. He never authorized it. He just didn't stop it. And this was a plan that was well underway, and I think there's a pretty common historical consensus now that this was a machine that had been put in motion that could only have been stopped by a direct presidential intervention, and Truman wasn't about to do that. When we created the Manhattan Project, we basically created the industrial equivalent of the US automobile industry in about 4 years to manufacture the material for the bomb. This was the big heavy lift, to manufacture something that had never been made before, plutonium, and something that had never been concentrated before, uranium-235, and it took a huge industrial operation. So you put all that together, and even though the bomb had been designed as a deterrent to Hitler, who we believed was building a bomb incorrectly, by the time we defeated Germany and there was no longer a need for the bomb, it was just too far along to stop. And there was a big desire among the military, one, to justify the program. So there was actual discussion of what would the Americans say when they find out how much this cost, and we didn't use it, and also to see what it would do. And there's no evidence that I know of that racism played a role in this. I think they would have used it on white Germans if we had still been fighting. But there might be some indication for why we used it twice. But by that point, frankly, the destruction of human life on this scale was commonplace. It just took more bombers to do it. It took hundreds of bombers to do what one bomb did for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that the race issue actually comes up with whether we do it again, and whether we would use it even against a country like Japan that does not have an atomic bomb. Would we? And there have been suggestions that we use it on Iran. I think the fact that these are non-white people is, for some people, makes it somewhat easier to decide to do it, and for others is a big warning flag that we can't do this again. We can't use an atomic bomb again on an Asian nation. It just wouldn't look right. But this does not discussed in official papers or formal policy debates. It just doesn't come up.
All right, so we have a question from a student. Do you believe that our Eurocentric education system encourages xenophobic thinking? Can we fight this? And do policymakers also encourage xenophobia in the United States?
I do think that Eurocentrism definitely has a big blame on that. As Latin American, personal story, I grew up being called Indian because of my color of skin. My parents did a lot of hard work trying to get me to private schools. And of course, most of private schools, colleges, etc., had people that were white, not as white as you guys, but they were white. And of course, I was different just by my color of skin. And when I start researching about this concept of Indian, it actually is an insult. That's how a lot of people use it, as an insult. And I started doing a lot of research on how much Latin America has tried to whiten itself because of this concept of Eurocentrism that says that the whiter you are, the better you are, the smarter you are, the more success you will have. Doors will open widely just for you and so a lot of people in Latin America, and my podcast, although the frame is myths, legends, and folktales, but literally if you listen to it, right after I normally talk about economy, politics, and stuff like that, because the best way to lure someone to listen is first telling them a story, and then you can go with the truth. So when I started researching about that, Latin America has tried so hard to whiten itself. Brazil is one of the biggest cases, Argentina, Chile. And it's based on anything that came from Europe was always way much better than whatever they found here. And they made a huge effort to try to erase whatever we had here. And so in my work, I always try to show, hey, these guys were super cool, the indigenous people that we had here, and they're still alive. And that is a big thing. If you're still alive after 500 years of oppression, you gotta be so smart. Yeah, because you had to dodge a lot of bullets for that. Yeah, maybe you're in reservations and all, but hey, you made it, man. It's not easy because the whole system was based on giving the privileges of succeeding and ascending in social class to those who claim themselves as white, to embrace the white culture, the European culture, who educated themselves in that, who learned, in our cases, Spanish. And so, yeah, I do think Eurocentrism has a lot to do with that. Now, you guys don't necessarily have Eurocentrism. You have, like, Americacentrism. I don't know how to say it. But you do live in a bubble, and that's what I realized when I came to this country. Sorry to say this. Please don't hate me for this, but I do think that sometimes you think this country thinks too much of itself. And it just recently is becoming more humble. And I appreciate the humbleness, but it's not all your fault. It's media for many years has just portrayed it like that this is a paradise, that the world is terrible. A lot of horrible things are happening there, not happening here, right, guys? Now, you don't have poverty. No. You don't have any of those problems. Of course you're not. And you should always go and save the world, of course, because that's what you did after World War II, right? But you're finally opening your eyes and seeing that there are so many other countries that are going through similar struggles like you, and you're not in this alone. And you might join forces with others. You're totally not alone.
This is a question for Miriam. What accounts for the perception of crisis at the border right now in light of decreased overall undocumented immigration? And one more question. Where in the world will receive the greatest migration pressure in 20 years? So here's some background information is that before the 1970s, there was no significant migration pressure coming from Mexico, right? The Mexican government also was really good at managing the migration flows. Also, there was no demand, right? So what we're experiencing a couple of years ago, now it's not even Mexicans coming over the border, right? It's mostly Central Americans. So what we experienced a couple of years ago, a decade ago, the Mexican immigration was a relatively new historical development.
Right. So in terms of whether we have a crisis now or not, I actually do think we have a crisis now. And the crisis really is rooted in the fact that we do have an unprecedented number of families coming across the border. So at the height of immigration in the 90s and the 2000s, we had Mexican men who were trying to, as much as possible, evade detection by the Border Patrol, sneak into the country, and go get that job, landscaping, gardening, dishwashing, whatever, building houses in Phoenix that was waiting for them. So that was a mass migration of single males. What has happened since is that with the advent of the surge in families and also unaccompanied minors who tend to be teenagers, well, one, we don't have the infrastructure at the border to handle this kind of population, right? These people are coming here and they're surrendering. They are being dropped off on the, on the other side of the border in Mexico by smugglers typically, who tell them, okay, walk to the nearest freeway, walk, I don't know, like 100 yards, 200 yards until you see a road, and then start waving your hand or wait, and eventually a vehicle from the Border Patrol will show up, scoop you up, and take you to be processed. I mean, that's so different from the guy who was just trying to, get across all the way undetected, living in the shadows, never interacting with law enforcement. So, we have we have a population that is more needy. We have a population that is turning itself in to our law enforcement. And, we have a government that has insisted in punitive deterrence measures that have clearly not worked. And I actually feel that the family separation policy, which will probably be the biggest stain on the Trump administration when we look back 20 years from now, because it just was so cruel, has actually backfired. Because what I'm hearing, and I was just at the border, and actually I took 40 hours of Greyhound bus with migrants to tell the story of their journey from when they arrive here to their destinations, and must have talked to dozens, if not more of them. And they all told me that the smugglers were communicating that the window of opportunity might be closing because we have this man named Trump, and one day he says one thing and one day he does something else, and perhaps, he'll start separating families again. So if you're considering going, because life in Guatemala is really hard now, there's climate change, the land is less productive, there is violence, you better go now. And people are mortgaging their homes and taking out loans from loan sharks that basically turn them into indentured servants to make the journey here. So I do think we have a crisis. I don't see an end to the crisis in sight. And really, the answer lies in the hands of Congress. I mean, our lawmakers need to overhaul the system because it's so broken. I mean, it's clear that there are, these people also have been told that they can get through and be released within days rather than to be detained for months if they come with a child. So yes, they want a better future for child, but why do they pick one child out of 4? Or why do they bring a child at all if they want to work? And what has also been interesting for me to see is that there are more and more fathers coming, which shows that these are men who are able-bodied wanting to work. And then the fact that we have a history of immigration from Central America, not as deep as from Mexico in this country, means that virtually every single person I meet who's just migrated knows someone in Nebraska, in Indiana, in Ohio, across the country who can take them in, help them get on their feet and find a job. And they may all be deported in a few years if our immigration, system, actually gets to the point of their deportation case, because they're all in deportation proceedings once they're processed. Because when you hand yourself in, you're here illegally, well, you're going to be deported. But if you say you're fleeing for your life and you're claiming asylum, we can't kick you right out. So you've got a case in court that, given the fact that our court's so dysfunctional now and that Trump is not interested in putting more resources into the immigration courts, it seems, these people are likely to be here semi-legally for at least 700 days on average until their case comes to an end. And by then, some of them may have gone into the shadows and skipped their court dates and, maybe happily working at, a restaurant or as, in the home of some family, or yes, as I've reported, in Mar-a-Lago or in Bedminster. So that was a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
Any other panelists want to chime in? All right, so the root of the administration's policies has been dehumanizing immigrants. What approaches do you think we can take to humanize immigrants again and reduce the fear? That's the first question. And I think I can combine this question with a very interesting question. Can the panel comment on a Brazilian saying, money whitens?
On what?
Money whitens. That money can change the color of your skin.
The
Yeah.
what?
Money whitens people.
Is there such a saying in Portuguese or?
I never heard it, but maybe.
All right.
So the first question is?
How can we actually, what steps can we take to humanize immigrants again?
I think storytellers have to do this. I really do.
I'll volunteer.
It's the 2 greatest American movies ever made are Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. And it's a story of immigrants. It's an immigrant story. And you see that, and you know, it somewhat feeds into certain myths and prejudices, but it also, you know, humanizes these people, and it sees the complexity, and I think we need to have more and more stories told, whether it's in film or orally or written, about the migration, this epic of migration that's happening in the country, so that we humanize these people and we don't just see them as a crisis or as a problem or as a horde, and we get to see them as individuals. And in some ways, you know, the ideal movie would be sort of a split-screen movie that would show the Irish and German and Italian immigration at the end of the 18th and 19th and beginning of the 20th century, and compare that migration story to what's happening today. And that would be because I don't think the solution to this is going to come from Washington. It may, in fact, come from the storytellers.
If I might say, I know that teachers, not all of course, but a lot of them, the ones that I visit when I go to schools, they're seriously trying hard to show those stories. You see their little libraries of all the pre-K to 5th graders, and there are all stories about migration, animal migration, or kids migrating. They're really trying, those who are sensitive to the subject, to share those stories. And I think our children are gonna have a better understanding, but we can't wait for them to grow up really fast in 24 hours. So the problem is how do we share the stories with the adults? And one thing that I found, I could be wrong, but I found that sometimes in some cases people begin to raise this defense towards immigrant stories, present immigrant stories, not the past, because the past always tends to be so nostalgic, and so it's always beautiful and nice, right? But the current ones, no one wants to hear more about it. And we are trying to push those stories in their faces. Look at this, Mom, and look at this. And there's a point in which you are just tired of hearing that sad story. And that's when I think mythology, legends, and folktales come in and have a great way to enter, because when you're pushing this other personal story, is you're almost telling the other one, if you don't cry for this, you're kind of racist. And that doesn't work with anybody, because you don't have to empathize with, I mean, there's no right that's or obligation that says you have to empathize with absolutely everything I say here, because if you don't, then you're a bad person. I mean, that would be terrible. But folktales and myths and legends is a non-threatened environment. No one has colors there. There's just heroes that go through these ordeals and they come out renewed and they make the world better. And that is a great way to start a good conversation right after that. That's just my take.
Let me just add one thing real quick, because the other thing it's not just the storytellers. One of the ways to challenge this and to change our views on this is what I saw when the President of the United States tried to actually implement another one of his campaign promises, the Muslim travel ban. And that response was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen in my life. Spontaneously, and then in an organized way, Americans flocked to the airports to protect these people, to help these people get into the United States or get back into the United States. And that kind of mass movement, that kind of mass pressure stopped what the president thought was in his power to do, stopped what many people wanted to, and completely changed the narrative around that. And it's that kind of mass movement, that kind of citizen activism, I think, that can be one of the greatest contributors to changing this own fear about the other.
Right, but unfortunately, his
Yes.
administration still decimated the total number of refugees that we would accept. I mean, we were a country that did welcome people who were fleeing for their lives, and the last year that Obama was in office, the commitment was 85,000. It now is 30,000, and I think maybe 12,000 people ultimately were allowed in because the background checks have become much tighter. There are families that have been, torn apart. I've met numerous families from countries, whether it's like Guinea and Ethiopia to, Iraq and other places who managed to get through and are still waiting for their loved ones, and it's really discouraging.
All right, so we have a number of questions about what can be done about the immigration crisis and the policies. So the first set of questions is about what policies can we adopt? Do we just give citizenship to everyone who crosses the border, or do we just give out green cards, right? And then we have this comment, right? So it's easy for most people to make fun of Trump and his wall, but aren't the Democrats also to blame for not coming up with a coherent policy regarding who should be allowed to enter the country legally? And the other set of the questions is really about helping the countries in Central America. So one question suggested, what would be like to have something that is along the line of Marshall Plan, right? Trying to help the countries and solve the problems at home. So which policy do you think is the best for making sure that the crisis doesn't get exacerbated?
I mean, of course, I don't have an answer on that because I'm just a storyteller. But
You probably use that line a lot.
yeah. But I always ask myself. I mean, I went through the whole process of getting a green card, filing all the documents, and of course, since I can read and write, and I had a master's degree, I don't pay a lawyer, and so we pay just the fees. And my question, a lot of this whole thing, the excuse that Mr. President uses for the immigrants is that they're taking the resources, right? Well, the other excuse is criminal. There's a lot of excuses, but one of it is an economic one. And my question is, if you're such in need of money, I'm pretty sure, why don't you just create a path for all these people that don't have documents, that would like to have their green card? They've been here for a long time, or they just arrived, and just give them a fine, fine them for, like, how many years have you been here without documents? 5 years. Okay, your fine is $500. All right, go ahead and pay it, and now go and fill out all the documents that you have to do for the green card, which is a lot, and pay the $2,700 that you have to do for that. That's how much I paid, and I think it went up to $3,000. And then just, if the problem is about money, they can put the resources working hard to pay for that, to earn it. They already earn it somehow with all that hard work. But if your problem is that they didn't earn it like I did legally, well, but just give them like a ticket, like speeding ticket. Just go pay it, and depending on your amount of years. That's what I always thought. But I think it never goes down to that, because I really think the problem is at the basis is racism. But that's it.
I mean, one thing that I say again and again is that, like, for every 10 immigrants who I meet, 9 of them just want to come here and work and go back home. And that's what they used to do. There used to be something that was called circular migration. Folks would come, they'd work a season, 6 months, or they might work a year, then they would go back. But the reason actually that we've had this demographic earthquake in this country is because we began to seal the border in the 1980s. And the more we sealed the border, the more expensive it got and the more difficult it got to get here. And so people started to stay, and they called for their wives, or they started to have families here. And that's how we got to where we are. And I'm not, opining on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but a workable guest worker program is just essential. And it's so sad that Congress cannot meet in the middle and even negotiate an agricultural worker visa that works. 75% of the people harvesting our food are undocumented, right? There's a program out there that's rather dysfunctional that is used by lots of farmers now because they can't get all the workers they need in America anymore because more undocumented males are not coming, and the ones here are all graying. And I mean, I saw this in the Salinas Valley recently in California, and it's just fascinating. Like these farmers who voted for Trump are despondent now. Anyway, I mean, so I think a guest worker program is essential. I mean, look, I mean, if you talk about the Democrats versus the Republican, who's not finding a solution? I mean, in 2013, we had a Senate bill that was supported by Republicans and Democrats, but we couldn't come to closure on it. There wasn't enough support from the House. It wasn't going to happen. And ever since then, the Congress has only become more polarized. And now we have a president who is, all about being, all about divisions and, all about being anti-immigrant to play to his base, when in fact, poll after poll, shows that most Americans are in the middle on this issue. I mean, I don't think the solution is to give everybody a green card, but there has to be some way to distinguish, people who have been here for however many years, who have American children, who have been contributing, and from people who maybe just came across and maybe they get guest worker passes, and the others get to say, I don't know, I'm not a policymaker, but certainly, the dysfunction now has gotten us to where we are now, and it's really disheartening.
Yeah, one small point on this. This is part of what I meant by xenophobia is whipped up, is somewhat manufactured for political purposes. And the 2013 debate this is perfect for this. There was a rational solution. There was a good policy solution. There was a lot of expert consensus about this, and you couldn't get it through. Why? Because a certain part of the Republican Party saw it as a great wedge issue, that they could use this issue to divide the Democrats and to attract a certain segment of the white voting population over to their side. And guess what? They were right. This works. So and you see the same thing happening on a number of issues. I would say that the one that worries me the most right now is how they're treating Ilhan Omar, the representative Ilhan Omar, and the kind of virulent racist attacks you're seeing on this woman who's made mistakes, who has not said the right thing in the right way, whose positions you can disagree with. But the way this woman is being attacked, she wears a hijab. She's one of the few first elected Muslims, and she's being targeted in this way, not just to defeat her, but to whip up a frenzy about this for domestic political and I would say foreign policy purposes.
It's conventional wisdom that the U.S. has always been an immigrant country, but in terms of policies, it has never been. Unfortunately, it is time to conclude our panel number 4503 entitled Xenophobia, History, and Hysteria. I would like to thank the panelists for their time and input.
Thank you.
As well as the audience for being courteous and asking insightful questions. Thank you very much.